So I'm going to hand over to Bettina. I think you have a certain point of view, which is that ethical leadership's been flying under the radar for far too long. And labels like transformation and servant or humble have had better publicity because they're sexier and less demanding than ethics, which I completely would agree with. But if you take a closer look, all these concepts are implicitly ethical. Unfortunately, most leaders' theories do not take a critical look at the obstacles to ethical leadership. And I'm going to let you talk into that a little bit more. I'll hand over to you.
Okay, so ethical leadership, it's such a tricky thing, right? Because already the combination of ethics and leadership, they are both very complex topics. Yeah, we look at least 2,000 years of history and rivers of ink that have flown in writing about them. Ethics, how should we act? How should we live together? What is the good life? These are really big questions, and every generation needs to answer them again because we have new challenges that come up in our lives. Leadership, how can we justify that one person should lead others? Who should be the leader? How do you lead? How do you become a leader? The topic that links both universes is power. And with power comes responsibility, but also a huge potential for abuse. And this is why leadership is inherently an ethical concept. Yeah, if we watch the conversations we had so far, this song from Love actually comes to my mind. You know, love is all around us. Actually, ethics is all around us all the time. So, and nobody would tell you, oh, we don't really need ethics in leadership. That's surprisingly different to my main topic, business ethics. When I say I'm in business ethics, I always, since 25 years, get this reaction, oh, very difficult combination, doesn't really fit. Yes. So, but it's different in leadership. And so I would like to dive right in and hear a little bit from the audience. So if you think ethical leader, what kind of persons come to your mind? So you type some names in the chat if you are inspired. Let's see. So maybe the warm-up wasn't long enough. Obama, yeah, okay, yeah. Mandela, very good. Brené Brown, interesting, more recent one. Gandhi, yeah, get this a lot. When I discuss with my business students ethical leadership and ask them about their ethical leaders, I also have Mandela and Gandhi and their mothers and fathers, but they never mention a business leader, never. So, and I think it's because our image of what the qualities of successful business leaders are kind of contradict ethics. If you think about some important, powerful business leaders like Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, Sheryl Sandberg, very impressive, inspiring leaders, but on the ethics side, not so sure. So let's also look at the audience. So do you have any ethical role models in business that come to your mind? I need my glasses for the chat. Dale Wentz. I don't know him. I would need to check him up. Okay. Yeah, so that's a more negative example of CEO that gave himself a pay cut. So that's what we see a lot. Oscar Romeo, Bill Gates. Yeah, Bill Gates maybe. Yeah. So you see the point. It's a tricky thing, ethical leadership in business, and still most leaders in business see themselves as ethical, whereas their followers are not so of this opinion. And there are lots of very complex topics for this, but I would like just to explore 3 of them. So the first ethics buster in ethical leadership in business is that we all think that we are good and ethical people. And if somebody tells us and that we are not and doubts our ethics, we instantly get very upset and defensive. You don't want to hear this. And this is why people in power hardly ever get feedback on their ethics, because their followers understand very well, if you do this, you jeopardize the relationship. But guess what? If you don't get tough feedback on your ethics, you don't advance in your ethical learning and your ethics awareness of yourself. Because ethically speaking, nobody's perfect and we all are work in progress. Second ethics buster is overconfidence. Of course, leaders need to be confident, otherwise they wouldn't be leaders. So just imagine Martin Luther King had said, oh, maybe I have this dream, not so sure if we will get there. That's not very convincing. Would you follow him? Probably not. But the downside, of course, of confidence is overconfidence. And then if there is a critical situation where you should take a step back and have some doubts and ask some critical questions, if you are in this, oh, I have to be confident all the time treadmill, you just don't have the reflexes to do it. And this bias is also often intimately married with the superiority bias, which means that we all think we are slightly above average, ethically speaking. If you ever lived with a roommate, you know this, because everybody's always convinced that they did the dishes more often than the other person. And the third most dangerous ethics buster is the power high. We know from neuroscience today that as a leader, your brain virtually gets drunk with power. And this has some nasty ethics, unfriendly consequences like lack of empathy, self-serving impulsivity, and incivility, disrespect, and a certain sense of entitlement. So we see there are some important obstacles up against you as a leader if you want to be one, stay one, and become better at this. If you don't pay super attention, are very committed and have a self-reflection of steel, it is very easily, it's a slippery slope, so very often you don't really notice that this is happening to you, especially for instance with the effect of power. All of a sudden, if you climb the corporate ladder, your jokes become funnier, and it takes a certain capacity to distance yourself from your status to realize, oh, actually I'm not becoming funnier, it's just the power thing that does this. Yes, so, but I wanted to go one step further. So this is the kind of the defense thing to stay ethical, but then I wanted to explore 3 more things, what you can proactively do to stay an ethical leader or become one. And here I get my inspiration from Aristotle, who said we are all born with a certain sense of ethics, morality, but then it's like a muscle and you need to work it if you want to build it and become better at it. So I would like to take you to the ethics gym and I show you 3 little tools that will work your ethical muscle so you can become ethically competent. So the ethics booster number 1 is preparation and anticipation. Because if you are dealing with difficult ethical challenges at work, in your leadership, without having thought through the situation before, that's very hard to do. You just add time pressure, performance pressure, and then the results are not so good. But in most professions and industries, there are certain ethical risks, like money laundering, insider trading in banking, or protection of data in telecommunication. that you can prepare and think through. And if you don't do this, it's basically a recipe for epic fails. The second muscle building tool for ethical leadership is appreciation. And I know we've talked a lot about this, how to value people. But I have a different angle on this, because why is appreciation so important for ethics? Because it's the basis. If your followers, your team members feel that you are really appreciating them, that you are genuinely interested in them, then that's the basis for the trust. Yeah. Without this, they won't trust that they won't trust you to speak up on ethics. Yeah. So you create the appreciation, then you can listen up so they can speak up, because they know it will be safe and worthwhile if they do this. And this is the magic antidote against the moral dangers of power. And my third exercise is more for the heart and the emotion. It's having a moral hero that would spark your motivation and help you to create some moral imagination. And I brought one example with me, that's Charlie Chaplin. And I think he's a great moral hero because he was super successful, but still always a dissident and never afraid to talk to power. He saw the downside of progress and capitalism very clearly, and still he always stayed very compassionate and full of humor. So he spread happiness. That's maybe one great task that ethical leaders should think about, spreading some more happiness instead of depression and dread and stress. So to wrap up these three propositions I have for your ethical muscles, there are, of course, not rocket science, but like in the gym, it is persistency that saves the day. And ethical leadership is not something you can do like, oh, let's have our ethical leadership moment together for 5 minutes today. No, it's a full-time job. And because you have to keep in mind as a leader, if you want it or not, you're under constant observation. And there's just no pause. It is a little bit like with your kids. You can't tell them to not be on their smartphones all the time if you are on your smartphone all the time.
Right. Brilliant. Yeah. Thank you very much, Bettina. There was so much there. You sparked some conversations in the chat there. Definitely moral hero. A lot interesting ideas there and spoken really well. So we'll pause on those, because I'm sure we'll get into a discussion afterwards. I'm going to move over to Devin. And Devin's point of view is that it's been said that crisis reveals who we are. Times of intense pressure test not only our character, but our ethical commitments. Ethical leadership during crisis is a result of how we've prepared ourselves and our organizations to make ethical decisions a habit, so that we can react ethically even when there's little room to breathe or think. So over to you, Devin.
Well, thank you, Sam, for that introduction, and it's great to be here. Thanks to everybody for joining. Thanks to Bettina for those thought-provoking remarks. And as folks will see, I think we're much more in alignment as opposed to opposed. I'm going to share my screen here. I have some slides I would like to go through very briefly. And so as CM mentioned, the focus of my presentation will be thinking about ethics under pressure. What does it mean to act ethically in times of crisis? And of course, crisis is a buzzword these days. I mean, we're undergoing a global pandemic and other situations of social and political upheaval right now. So crisis is very much an important paradigm to be thinking through, and leadership resilience and ethical leadership through crisis. But of course, we don't need a global pandemic to be thinking about issues of crisis. Various other smaller crises are continually emerging that face us in our personal lives as well as in our organizations. And so what does it mean to think about ethics under pressure? And Bettina put the Love Actually song in our head. Now I'm hoping that the David Bowie, Freddie Mercury, Queen song will be in your head, and the bass line is perhaps already going in the background now of your minds. But what do we know about pressure? What does it do? We know that it puts us into this fight or flight mode, right? That our adrenaline kicks up, and we're under a stress response when pressure, whether it's time compression, whether it's other sorts of crises that emerge. And so because of that, it increases things like cognitive bias. Now, all of us have cognitive biases. We all have ways that we perceive and misperceive the world. That's just sort of a normal part of being human and of being finite, if you will. But under certain types of pressure, those are elevated, and different cognitive biases, ways that we misperceive things, can be exacerbated or made more extreme. Same with various ways that we might misperceive or look at situations in ways that are slightly skewed. They're going to be increased. And of course, under pressure, we're more prone to make snap judgments. We don't feel like we have the sort of space, the room, the time to sit back and reflect necessarily on the best course of action. When there is a sense of crisis, when there is a sense of, whether it's, again, time compression or other kinds of challenges that are coming up in the situation. And there's a certain kind of autopilot that kicks in. And this is not a bad thing. This is a survival mechanism. This is part of our neurobiology, part of our biochemistry, if you will, as well. And so this is a coping strategy. And so the issue is, what does that autopilot look like? How has that been prepared or shaped so that when we kick into autopilot, how can we respond in ways that are actually better or more ideal? So there are three areas that I want to talk about in terms of ethics under pressure, and Bettina already mentioned and invoked this one, but I have 3 Ps to think about for ethics under pressure: preparation, priorities, and process. So we'll use 3 Ps to make it memorable, 3 Ps to respond to pressure. So this is, if there's sort of a major sort of thesis or claim, it's this idea that how you prepare in terms of your ethical stance in times of, you know, relative peace, relative stability, relative calm, that's going to shape how you respond in times of crisis. And so take advantage of times where things are rather stable to actually begin to prepare your responses ethically, so that when you don't actually have room to stop and think, you can do so. I've trained in martial arts for a lot of my life, and I can remember early on as I began my training and I was in sparring situations facing an opponent, and I can still recall the feeling of thudded fists hitting my face and padded feet kicking my ribs as my instructor walked around me shouting out, "Stop thinking, you think too slowly. Don't think, react." In situations like that, where you're under pressure, in this case being attacked, you don't have room to pause and stop and think, oh, how do I block this kick? How do I block this punch? You need to respond automatically, which is why in martial arts, as well as in other kinds of sports and other kinds of activities, you drill, right? You do repetitions, you do prearranged responses. In karate, they call it kata or forms. In boxing, it's various combinations, right? And you drill these things and make these things automatic so that your body responds in the ways that it needs to be, the ways that it needs to in these kinds of scenarios. And so I use this as a metaphor, as an analogy for the ways that we can train ourselves to prepare to respond in some ways on autopilot, but in better ways to remain ethical under pressure. We have heard from Aristotle already, and I'm going to reiterate him. So this is from Aristotle. This is not an exact quote. This is my paraphrase, but his idea that character is a collection of various habits, or what he calls virtues, that are developed over time. And it's through a process of continually choosing what is good. So choosing what is ethical, choosing what is good becomes a habit, and that shapes our character. So some practical ways to prepare as a leader within your organization and among your people. Don't assume that people know what it means to be ethical, or that your values as an organization are there and explicit. Make them explicit. Raise them to the level of consciousness. Raise them to the level of explicit conversations within your team, within your organization, among those that you interact with. Take the time beforehand to determine what the best practices are. What are the courses of action, the sort of chain of action that one would respond to beforehand when you have this space to think. And again, to use this terminology, to flex your ethical muscles so that you can over time make them to some degree automatic. Shifting on then to priorities. So we've talked about preparation, but the issue then is, well, what are you preparing? What is the content of your preparation? And here what I mean is to take some time to think about what are your actual ethics and values? What are you as an individual, and what is your organization about? How would you describe it in terms of your own core commitments, your organizational core commitments? How would you describe what you value and what you sort of rank as most important as an organization, as a team, as the various networks of relationships that you find yourself in? And when you sort of step back and perceive yourself and imagine yourself and your organization acting ethically, what does that look like? Can you paint a picture in your mind of what that actually looks like to act ethically in the world? And what is that impact that your organization has on your own people, on those that are shaped within that organization, as well as the footprint that it leaves socially, within its community, nationally, within whatever country you're working in, but of course, globally as well. Some practical things to think about in terms of how you might elevate these priorities to be more explicit. Create a values statement. And this is something that Bettina can speak to. This is one of her areas of expertise. She works with organizations to do this and has a lot of experience doing that. As well, take this very sort of vague statement and make it concrete rather than these general kind of very pie in the sky floaty notions of values that sound very good that everybody can kind of say, oh yeah, of course, that sounds great. What does it actually look like concretely? What does it look like when it touches down on the ground, so to speak? So provide cases, provide examples for people to think about as it's made more concrete. Include values as part of your recruitment and hiring process. So when you hire and interview, don't just think about technical skills, how the person can perform the job you need, but how do they exhibit and how do they mesh well with the kinds of culture and values that you're trying to establish as an organization. And then for those that are part of your team and organization, how can you sustain and maintain the various values? And there's various exercises, games, and different events that you can do to raise these issues, to make them explicit again in people's minds, to force them to think through challenges and cases, and various games that you can do to create scenarios where an ethical dilemma comes up. I'm not going to dwell on this. I'm just going to mention this very briefly in passing for the sake of time. I won't go into this, but there are various ethical values that one can bring to mind in various perspectives. And I just want to suggest the ethics of care as a really important one. And we can come back to this in discussion if people are interested. But this is becoming more of a focus within business finally, which is great, but it's a very important set of ethical theories about what care involves. And again, I'm just going to skip over that for now. So let's talk about the third and final P, process. So there are various ways that you can streamline or prepare a process so that when things happen organizationally on autopilot, they follow a more productive and more ethical progression. So determine ahead of time who makes what decisions can be made solo, what decisions need to be made in consultation with others, who has the sort of decision-making authority over various spheres within the organization. There are, of course, ways to establish checks and balances, to have different people in different committees or teams checking in on different decisions as they're being made to ensure that the different biases that we all have are being mitigated, are being counterbalanced. Some organizations create what I call a veto room, but some sort of, or veto team, a group of people that are there to kind of poke holes. They're intentionally there to challenge, intentionally there to say, well, have you considered this? They play devil's advocate and they challenge whatever initiative is being set forward by the organization as a way to challenge it. And you can do that ethically as well. Create debates and various perspectives where those within the organization can come together and provide opposing viewpoints. And it's also important when you create these types of structures and processes to explore them in different timescales. And what I mean is, what can be carried out when things are very intense and a decision needs to be made quickly versus when things can happen over a slower period of time. And so obviously under crisis, when there's time compression, you want to be able to have these kinds of chains of decisions happen more efficiently. And so this is something to explore and to practice. So these three areas, again, that I offer to you to think about preparation, to think about the priorities, and to think about the process that you want to establish as an organization so that you can respond ethically under pressure. I will stop sharing now. Thanks very much.
Mhm. Brilliant. Thank you, Devin. And it's fascinating as I listen to you both, and I'm really interested in what people are picking up from what you've both said. So please do post in the chat the thoughts that are coming up, or any questions that you have. I know there are some questions there I will come to, but what I'm fascinated by listening to both of you is that these are conversations that you know, these capabilities, the preparation aspect for anything really, the preparation for what you do in certain situations, what position you'll take. Preparation is such a big part of how leaders can be more effective generally. So that's an important piece. And then Devin, you talked about, you know, the delegation process. And how important that is, and at the same time, Bettina, you were saying, you know, we have an overconfidence in our ability to do things, or how we see ourselves, and part of that is as we gain more power, we have this overly positive sense of ourselves. And I see that in, you know, when I ask leaders, you know, are you good at delegating? And yeah, sure I am, but there'll be a host of other things that they're challenged with, and they haven't connected that one is related to the other. This ability to be explicit in what you're stating, and the instructions that you're giving, or the clarification about what's okay behavior versus what's not okay behavior. So, and it's nice, I heard you say you're more aligned than there are differences, and we could certainly see that, but I think both of you have come at it from different perspectives. Bettina, I wondered whether you might comment on, add any more thoughts to Devin's presentation and thoughts about his position, and then I'll come back to you, Devin.
Do this. Okay, yes, so I think the point that Devin made with the preparation, with these drills, the katas, though it comes automatically, is super important, and we can still go, we can even use our muscle metaphor here, so it becomes muscle memory, so you don't have to think, because yeah, and the other thing I find super important in Devin's talk is that you should, of course, you need this kind of culture and leadership part in order to prepare your organization, but you also need the process. And the problem at the moment with most companies and organizations is when they think ethics and ethical leadership, they think process. It's mostly driven by compliance with rules and procedures, and the really dangerous thing, and we see that's why all these corporate scandals keep happening, because it's not linked to the leadership, because then compliance is bugging the leaders with all these rules and stuff they need to do, and that they don't want to have anything to do with it because it slows them down in their business. They don't think it's necessary, and so I'm trying to work a lot in making the connection clear. What's the benefit for you as a leader if I'm an ethical leader? It is like we've seen with the first talk of Margaret Everman, that often we have this picture in our mind that business and ethics doesn't fit. And then she had this great example with the nurses in Holland. But then you gave them the freedom to judge how much time they spent with one patient, and all of a sudden the patients got healthy again much faster because they had this personal touch. So in a way, giving the ethical freedom to the nurse did surprisingly good things for the economic thing. So that's why we need, as Devin said, we need to get a check on our stress levels when we are in these kinds of tough choices, because when we are in the stress level, we tend to think, oh, it's either I do the efficiency part or I do the ethics part, and that costs some money and it's sacrifice. No, you can find more creative ways.
My turn to unmute. Thank you, Bettina. Devin, do you have any comments that you would like to make in response?
Sure. Yeah, no, and I appreciate Bettina's mention of this issue of compliance, which I think is important to note, because I feel like a lot of times ethics is reduced to two things. One is compliance, and the other is CSR, or corporate social responsibility. And so organizations think, well, as long as we're sort of following the letter of the law, that's all we need. Or let's go out and do a little bit of good to make up for the evil we've done in the world. And that's the way that we kind of wash our hands of ethics, right? And those are, I think, wrong ways to sort of think about ethics. And I think what both Bettina and I are talking about are ways to integrate ethical and a moral compass within the organization itself, through leadership, through shaping mid-level management, through shaping teams as well. And so I think that's important to underscore. And also just to reiterate that I think that, I take Bettina's contrast between character and competence to be, a critique of, which I agree with, a critique of a sort of an older, outdated model of ethics, that there are these sort of great charismatic people, usually typically men, who are born with these natural notions of what it means to be a great ethical leader. And it's a very outdated, but unfortunately still holds on to, it's hanging on. This notion that great leaders are born and they sort of fulfill this charismatic great man sort of model. And so there's a need to challenge and critique that, and to think about the kinds of competencies and ways that people can, are shaped and become ethical over time. And the ways that we exist in webs of relationships. I think that's important to keep in mind too, that we are relational beings, that ethics doesn't happen in a vacuum. You can't sit in a room somewhere and be ethical. Ethics is about how you interact, and it's by necessity relational. And so to imagine ethics as an individualistic enterprise is wrongheaded. And so ethics is about our networks of relationships and how we behave and act in those kinds of responsibilities and obligations that emerge in those networks.
Wonderful. Well, look, I could monopolize your time, but that's not the point here. I'm going to move over to some questions and some of the comments in here. Someone said, love the thought about exploring ethics in interviews. And I know your comment there, Devin, about bringing in the acting ethically, even hiring and recruitment, which I know Glenn will be jumping for joy at the sound of. Do you think it's a case of prioritizing being true to your ethics over motives, even if you personally and your organization may be impacted adversely?
Right. This is, a real interesting dilemma that one thinks about in terms of whether you should be totally clear about your ethics. And this is a challenge that people need to think about. Are you okay sort of not being fully disclosive of your ethics and values just for the sake of getting that job, right? And then this is it's just a hard judgment call. If somebody is desperate to get hired and needs to actually earn a wage for the time being, I understand that there may be a need to not fully, find the ideal dream ethical fit, right? And so this is something that job seekers need to think about. And one of the people that I coached is coming to mind now as a decision that he came to make, where he's just not taking certain interviews as he determined what these companies were about, and he's become much more determined in finding a fit that fits with him ethically in terms of his values, and I commend him for that. And from the side of hiring committees and recruitment, there are ways, I think, to create case studies and dilemmas where there are these famous cases that are often presented, particularly for consulting interviews, and it's designed to see how people think in terms of strategy and in terms of their mathematical abilities to think about maximizing profit and ROI and all these kinds of things. But what would it mean to actually create cases that try to get at other things that are equally important in terms of the ethical and moral compass of the people that you're interviewing? And I think those can and should be done as well. And there's ways to do that and do that much better.
Yes, I think the point that Devin just made in how to, so it's the ethics of choosing your employer and choosing your employees is actually very interesting. It's one thing I always try to sensitize my young students. They're bachelors and they just think, oh, I want to have this exciting job, da da da, and I want to show them that it is important to also look a little bit deeper and see how ethical is your company and broaden their horizon, because my kind of provocative thesis is that unethical businesses make unhappy people. Yeah, so of course you can work in not so ethical companies and earn lots of money, but maybe think about this before. And from the side of choosing your employees, that's of course a tricky thing, because you can always fake ethics, right? But only to a certain degree. So the method that also Devin is proposing with games and scenarios, I work a lot also with this, with a game where there's little stories like does something come to my mind now? No. So little stories like I'm in the middle of a negotiation for a new client, for a new client, and he says, well, if you give me this business commission, then I will give you some secret information about your competitors. So you discuss, so what would you do in this situation? And then if you have people explain what they would do and why, I think it's kind of hard to fake this to a certain degree. So that will be something that's doable. And that's also very important in general, to create a safe space where people can talk about these things that happen in their day-to-day life. Because when I do this with my trainings in companies, in the beginning, everybody's kind of shy, but when I use my game with the little stories, they just start to talk about all these things, but then normally never have the opportunity to talk about, but that is still very draining and heavy for their everyday life.
Yeah, and I guess it's knowing what's safe to talk about and what are we talking
right
about here. Where are the walls in this conversation? Yeah,
exactly. And lots of that's one of the problems why we have so many problems in business ethics, because usually that's something we are very reluctant to talk about. And before a scandal breaks, the people in the company have known about these things at least for a year.
Yes, absolutely. We have got another question here. There's also an interesting statement I'll come to in the chat. But Mag asks, ethics covers such a wide range of things, and indeed every decision we make, and it's an evolving process as we experience life, and we have not been ethical all the time of our whole existence. What's the best way to own this, that we have this fallible, that we are fallible in order to foster an openness, and that it's a process as a team? I think I caught that deciphered. That must have been fast typing there. What are your thoughts on that? How can leaders be more open about that and actually incorporate some of those discussions among their team, maybe as a regular thing?
Yeah, so the most important thing, of course, is that leaders get this in their agenda, because we kind of have to be compassionate about leaders, because there's so much on their plate. I mean, they have to be vulnerable, they have to be have to have this kind of they need 8 arms, right? So what does it help? I think if they get the ethics as a new lens to their leadership, that can help in many things. Yeah, because one ethical concept is fairness. And that's often something that people underestimate, the destructive power if somebody feels treated unfairly. And often leaders do this without noticing that, because fairness is often something in the perception, and as Devin said so nicely, you need to make these decisions and discourses about ethics and fairness, and why did he get the promotion, she not. You need to make it explicit, because whatever you do, it will get interpreted. Yeah, so I guess that's the most important thing. And of course, the challenge for leaders is that they never learned it. There's no, usually in business school, you don't have a module on how to be fair, how to communicate, that you don't, so that people will talk to you, that you're not scared, how to be aware, how your status alone might scare people. I guess, yeah, that's why I'm such a fan of competency, because it's a really, it doesn't take a lot, but you kind of need to prepare for this and have some ethical checkpoints in your meetings, in your conversations.
Well, and I think fairness is an important one. It happens so much, and whether you have been fair or it's perceived to be unfair, I think those are things that as a leader you do need to be mindful of. That is a responsibility of yours. You know, favoring one over another, you know, favoring, paying more attention to one team member than another. It can happen in those ways. And so I think that being mindful of that, because it's very demotivating for those who feel that they've been treated unfairly and that they haven't had that. Devin, I'm going to hand over to you. We have one more question, and I can't believe the time's kind of flown by. So Devin, over to you.
I mean, one of the things that Mag's question raises that I think is really important is this issue of what does it mean to be vulnerable as a leader? I mean, that's part of what I hear there is what does it mean to be vulnerable and to admit one's failures? And that's, I think, an issue that's a struggle for many leaders is how do you balance projecting confidence and projecting a sense of confidence in the vision and the mission of the organization with a sense of being authentic and real in terms of your own failings and in terms of the ways that you have fallen short. And of course, there's no sort of easy prescription that I can give in terms of what that looks like for everyone. But I think I just want to raise that to make that explicit for people. And I would think that, my sense is, I think leaders can do well to err toward the side of vulnerability and authenticity. I think, we typically see a lot more of the, maintaining sort of a blustery, strong, confident front. But of course, this varies depending on context and the background of the leader as well. But I think it's important for leaders to model admitting when they've made mistakes and creating space to do that and creating safe space to discuss that, and to model holding themselves accountable, and getting input from others, and letting the organization, letting the team see that they are actually consulting others and receiving and taking to heart the input of others, rather than sort of presenting themselves as just a solo decider, a solo thinker who is coming to these conclusions on their own. You're muted.
Oh, it's been a fantastic, intensive 2 days. I'm going to go over to the questions. We've got, I'm going to have to pick one of these, so just give me a moment to process what's on them. Ethical versus moral. Can you be ethical even if your moral compass is off course? That's one question. And then another one is, I'm curious to hear the panelists speak about the contemporary social unrest in the US. Is this covered under Devin's focus on crisis ethics? Bettina's emphasis on ethical muscle. Maybe we can go there, seeing as it is quite a topical one. And I think you're staying for the panel discussion, so some of the other things we might be able to cover off. So Devin, why don't you go ahead and answer that one from Leonard?
Yeah, thank you, Leonard, for that very important question. It was very much on my mind as I put this together. So I do think of that as part of the crisis that's raising these issues. And so, responding ethically under crisis, I think, is something that this social unrest and these calls for challenging institutionalized forms of racism and injustice, I think, are very much calling to mind. It's also part of why I wanted to mention the ethics of care, as I think something that's central that organizations need to take to heart. And what would it mean to incorporate care for the vulnerability of those who are within organizations, as well as the vulnerability of those that are impacted by organizations? What would it mean to actually take that seriously and incorporate that into the values and commitments of an organization, and into how people are treated within those organizations? So yeah, I think it's absolutely part of the conversation.
Bettina, would you like to comment on that? And then we'll wrap up and take a break before the panel session. But yes, Bettina, it would be lovely to hear from you.
Okay.
And yeah.
Yes, so the thing I also wanted to mention, well, you need this preparation, so your best ethical part emerges in the crisis. But very often we see also a different thing happening, that basically good people, when they are in these high pressure situations, suddenly the worst of them emerges. We've seen it in many social psychology experiments, like the Milgram experiment, where just a little pressure from authority and people are ready to basically electrocute a stranger, and many other examples where just the bubble of the context got so closed. Yeah, like in the Enron big corporate scandal, there was if you only work all the time, you don't get input from the rest of the world. Everything in your bubble seems completely justified. And what we also know from behavioral economics is that very often well, everybody cheats a little bit, and it depends what kind of stories we tell ourselves, why this is justified. Oh, I had to do it because of this and this and the competition. And so one important final point would also be to be critical of the stories you tell yourself to justify your decisions.